Hello and good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today. We'll just wait a few more seconds before we start this briefing on Libya. Warm greetings from Geneva and Paris, where our speaker Jalal is talking to us from now. I see the number of participants increasing quite rapidly, so thanks for all the great interest. And we'll just wait 15 more seconds and we go ahead. And thank you again, Jalal, for joining us and briefing us today.
Thank you.
Okay, let's start. Good afternoon and hello to all of our audience today, and thank you so much for joining and welcome to this webinar, to this expert briefing offered by the Security Assessment in North Africa project, the SANA project, and the Small Arms Survey. Warm greetings from Geneva, where we're based, and thank you for your interest once again to be with us today. My name is Ala Tartir, and I'm a researcher at the Small Arms Survey and the project lead of the SANA project, the Security Assessment in North Africa. And it is truly my pleasure and honor to welcome Jalel Harchaoui today to brief us on Libya. A very warm welcome to you, Jalel, and it's always great to be in your company in this, this briefing. And Jalal will be briefing us on Libya, and we will be assessing the current dynamics and also the future outlooks for Libya. Where do we stand today, and what is next for Libya and for the Libyans? Jalal is an internationally recognized, established expert on Libya and beyond. He is a senior fellow at the Global Initiatives Against Transnational Organized Crime, the Global Initiative, as well as a SANA expert since 2017. And the publications of Jalal are available on our website at the Small Arms Survey. And also you can read the analysis of Jalal published in many other places like Foreign Policy and many other media outlets concerning Libya, the current landscape of Libya from security point of view and also political economy point of view. So thank you again, Jalal, for being with us, and also a very warm welcome to the audience who are with us today. And for the ones who are not able to be with us today, this is a reminder that this webinar is recorded and will be available on our website and YouTube channel after this webinar. And also, this is an occasion to remind you all to follow us at the Small Arms Survey on social media, as well as joining our mailing list, because we promise you so many interesting briefing papers and reports coming your way and landing in your inbox. This is a quick reminder as well that this is the third webinar in our 5 parts webinar series on expert briefings. After this webinar, we have 2 more next week, next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Geneva time. We will have a briefing on Morocco, and the week after on Burkina Faso. So also please join us, and in the chat bar we have the links to register for these webinars and also to join our mailing list. And finally, before we start the briefing, I would like to thank the Netherlands and the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs for its continued investment and support to our project, the Security Assessment in North Africa. And for all their investment in our work at the Small Arms Survey more broadly. I will have around 5-6 questions to Jalel that we will start addressing now. But before that, and this is a note to our audience, please send your questions in the chat function and I will read it in the Q&A session. If you have any questions from now, please add it or as we proceed in the briefing. So I took my 4 minutes to do the introductions and the reminders, and now Jalal, over to you to take us in this journey about what is happening in Libya now and where are we heading. So my first question is that many things have happened over the past 6 months in Libya, rapid changes. Can you please highlight the main issues and developments or regressions to our audience in order to better understand where does Libya and the Libyans stand as of today?
Thank you very much, Ala. It's a pleasure and honor. I'm always thankful for the friendship that I've had with Small Arms Survey and SANA for the last few years. So thank you again. I wish to begin by first of all saying that there hasn't been any meaningful war fighting in Libya for the last 11 months, roughly, except a few incidents. And I would like to also say why I believe there has been this precarious form of peace, or at least it's a technical calm that has prevailed since essentially the month of June of last year. And something happened a little bit less than a year ago, roughly around the 6th and 8th of June. There was an attack, or at least an offensive, conducted by the Tripoli forces, the recognized government, the UN recognized government, backed by Turkey and of course the thousands of Syrian mercenaries. They tried to take the city of Sirte. The city of Sirte is a small municipality smack in the middle of the coast, and they took a beating. And the Russian forces did most of the work. It's not Egypt that had declared its red line at the time. Most of the work was done, of course, by the Libyan brigades of Haftar, Marshal Haftar, and a tremendous part of the actual defense work had been carried out by the Wagner mission, the Russian mercenaries. And we're talking about almost 3,000 that have been in Libya for the last couple of years. And after this, what happened is that Turkey and Russia, which had already begun talking when it came to the withdrawal from of the Russian forces from Tripoli, which led to the defeat, the quite humiliating defeat of Haftar. We'll talk about that in a second. But then, you know, the Turkish-backed camp tried to kind of push the envelope and try to see if Sirte was feasible in terms of an additional takeover. And it's very important because you have the oil right to the east of Sirte. You have the oil percent. And that failed. And after that, the conversation between Ankara and Moscow is what I believe that is effectively the process that led to the calm. So you have another interpretation, which basically indicates that the Western diplomats have done a fantastic job, that the UN was really, delivering genius stroke after genius stroke. But as a realist, you could argue that it's that tacit decision by the two main, not the only ones, the main interferers, foreign interferers in Libya, that kind of decided to kind of let the dust settle and be satisfied with that map. And that map basically has prevailed ever since. And it's one where almost all of the oil is controlled by Marshal Haftar, or at least his camp. And then if you were asking about the last 6 months, there has been one particular event that I would like to highlight. And it was hailed as a historical event. It's March 10th. March 10th saw 132 parliamentaries of the House of Representatives, usually based in Tobruk, show up in Sirte, the same city. And 121 of them actually voted yes in terms of vote of confidence for the new cabinet of the designated Prime Minister Abdelhamid Dbeibah, who had been recognized by the UN on the 5th of February of this year. So that kind of commitment and engagement and mobilization and just the sheer percentage of the yes votes was actually saluted as a huge breakthrough. And it's arguably true, but you can also look at it from a game theory perspective. If you recognize that the president of the House of Representatives, Aguila Salah, who wanted to become president in February but failed, if you view him as a power center, then you could imagine that it's actually optimal for him to cause the peace process to become addicted to this kind of recognition, legitimacy, embrace through the parliament. Very old parliament. It was voted like the vote happened in 2014, but it still means a lot. And then after that, the optimal behavior is not to necessarily continue delivering this kind of yes votes. Maybe the optimal behavior in order to maximize the influence is to be as difficult as possible. And that's what we have seen since March 10th. There's, it's almost the first half of the year has already elapsed. And Abdelhamid Dbeibah, the new prime minister, is someone who doesn't define himself based on security issues. He's kind of hands off when it comes to his security issues, but he's really a money man. He's a business person. And he wanted to kind of buy popularity by distributing a lot of allocations and funds to the households of Libya, fix the electricity grid by summer, distributed all kinds of contracts to not only Turkey, its close friend, but also Russia, Egypt, Italy. And he wanted to really have the first national budget approved by the legislature as the first time since 2014. That's exactly what the parliament is not giving him. So I don't want to give a too pessimistic picture. You have an attorney general that was decided, that's the Deqassour, and you have other events. But the whole euphoria of the month of March is gone, and now you can look at basically a government that is struggling in terms of recognition. And so the picture is kind of a little bit more in line with the Libya that we know, cynical, slow, difficult. Every step is basically like pulling teeth. And so that's where we stand right now.
Many thanks, Jalel, for these very insightful remarks. I'm sure they will generate questions, and I already see first question coming in. But continuing to building on what you just mentioned, recently, our colleagues at the International Crisis Group just published a report, and they recommended, and I quote here, that with the UN help, the new Libyan government should hasten to clear two last hurdles: establishing a legal framework for elections and clarity about who holds supreme command of the armed forces. These were the two main recommendations and two key messages of the report that was just published. Do you agree with this take? And if yes, why and how they can do this? Because they seem to me like quite two difficult asks. But also, if you don't agree with this policy prescription, then why? And what would you recommend as alternatives to these two top hurdles?
Yeah, well, I agree with the fact that those two issues are very, very important. I would add to them, the national budget, which I think is very important because it's attached to the rescue of the entire banking system. And there's a tradition among analysts not to talk about the financial sector, which I think is a mistake. But those two issues are very important. I disagree, of course, with the phrasing of the recommendation because they imply that it's possible that, for example, the army could be reunified this year, and I disagree with that. I don't think it's possible at all. So I will answer one by one. The first one is the vote, this idea of conducting elections, general elections. So the presidential role, which doesn't exist constitutionally, and also the legislative, like refreshing the parliament in December of this year. And of course, as we have gotten used to over the last 4 years because of the UN, because the UN created the presidency or the presidential council, if you will, in 2016. Now it needs kind of to be created constitutionally in order to conduct the real universal vote, or maybe not, maybe a different process. And that's exactly one issue that has been tossed around for the last several weeks. The phrasing of it and the way it's framed is, of course, the devil is in the detail. Is it important? Is it really necessary to have a universal vote for the presidential election and have the parliament held separately, or is it possible to imagine and accept, at least this year, a process by which the president is designated by the parliament or chosen by the parliament? So this is one issue that has been kind of distorted, because now people think that, or at least that's what they imply, some of the people behind the way it's depicted in the social media, for instance, and the entire debate, is that there's this implication that if the presidential election is direct and universal, then it has to require a referendum before the actual elections in order to have a proper constitution decided by the people through this referendum mechanism. And there's no formula that indicates that it's necessary to do it this way. Actually, as part of the peace process, what was being used was simply the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, and that body was able to produce on a constitutional basis, minus that part. The question of how the president should be chosen is still unresolved, and it's supposed to be resolved this month by July 1st. And so here you have this expectation, knowing that the parliament hasn't voted for the national budget, and we're almost, as I said, into the second half of the year. There's this expectation that maybe all of a sudden the House of Representatives would become very serious and committed and deliver the 2/3 majority necessary to approve the new constitutional basis. So you see, the agenda is absolutely ambitious. And there's another scenario, which is, at least in theory, possible, is that the Libya Political Dialogue Forum, which is based in your town, Geneva, actually takes care of this, takes care of actually complementing the draft and approving it, because the HRR and the High Council of State, which acts like the Senate, like the upper house, the upper chamber, if they are too slow, then maybe you have the possibility of the UN actually doing this. But you see that it's very politicized, and even amongst, we can discuss this, even amongst foreign states, the attitude towards the elections is not uniform. Now, going back to the unification of the armed forces, there has been one process called the 5+1, the 5+5 based, that has actually met insert, always the same town, which is very important because it's really at the center. It's between the East and the West. There was a lot of talk last year of demilitarization, like emptying that city, make sure that all the mercenaries leave and becomes completely a pacified area, neutral area, and then use that success on the part of 5+5 to continue unifying the armed forces. But that process actually worked out decently in October, maybe the autumn of 2020. You had some exchanges of prisoners operated through that process. But all of this has basically degraded. It's not as healthy. And in all cases, what we saw over the last couple of days is a huge parade by the Field Marshal Haftar. I mean, he still exists. He still views himself as the national army. Of course, he's confined in the East. He's, of course, also present in the Southwest. But he conducted a very expensive parade with a lot of new equipment. A lot of people, probably 20,000 people somehow seen on camera. Nobody knows whether all of those people actually are Libyan soldiers. But this message is clear. Is to show that there's no willingness to be absorbed by any force. No real genuine dialogue to kind of unify all of this with his Western counterparts. You have the Chief of Staff, Mohammed Haddad, who also views himself as the head of the military forces, the armed forces of the official government in Tripoli. That process, the unification, is completely empty. It's not happening. And I would go even further. I would say that as long as the Haftar family is at the top of the Libyan National Army, so-called, such process will not happen by construction, because these people do not recognize it. And if you pay attention to the speech given by the field marshal, he said basically that the presence of Turkey in the West, the presence of Turkey's own Syrian mercenaries in the Tripoli area are a violation of the peace process, and therefore he basically sees a big problem. So the process of unification is not happening, and I don't think it can happen, certainly not this year.
And what will happen when we bring the elections to the mix? You already described where do we stand and where Libya stands, and so what about the elections scheduled for later this year? How can these elections be meaningful and generate positive outcome, primarily to the Libyan people? And I mean, you talked about the hurdles for unifying security reform, but can these elections be perceived as a way or avenue to bridge the intra-Libyan divide, or is that too ambitious to expect from the forthcoming election? And maybe this is a good opportunity also to ask, what are some of the key prerequisites for successful and meaningful elections?
Well, we talked about this idea of being able to define the existence of the president constitutionally before the elections. So that's an issue. You have also two other problems, or at least two issues that need to be addressed before anything is conducted in real life. You have physical security, electoral security. How do you make sure that people can go to the booth and vote without it being turned into a trap or turned into a controversial gesture that is maybe subject to threats, or simply some areas that are not protected by either of the main factions? You have those areas in Libya. So you have a whole series of technical, physical security related issues that would need to be addressed, and I'm not sure if they're going to be addressed, simply because the process has not begun. I have not seen anything happening really. I'm not even talking about the issues of fraud. Like, if you cannot physically control the mechanism, then you have all kinds of fraud in some areas, not the majority necessarily, but you cannot be comfortable that there's no fraud at all in a massive way. Then you have another issue, which is the atmosphere, right? If the atmosphere is too polarized, and you have this process that basically is bent on coming up with a president, which is like a unique winner in this country that is still in battle, then you could typically imagine incidents happening right before the vote, or right after the vote, or between the two rounds, for example, if there are two rounds. I'm not saying this is impossible. I'm just saying that the population, of course, if it sees a decent process that produces someone with greater amounts of legitimacy, they would prefer it, of course. And I think the culture does exist. People are acutely aware of what it means, and the fact that it worked, in 2012, they remember what went wrong in 2014. So the consciousness of it, the awareness, the engagement, the interest is there. It's just that it's so easy to spoil. You don't need much to kind of derail the whole process. And as I said, internationally, you have some states that are being kind of, if it could just slow down and we go beyond the deadline and we end up with a government that we know and we could conduct business with that government, and the elections happen only in 2023 or whatever it is, then maybe it's not so bad. I would put in that category states like, of course, Russia, Egypt, Turkey, obviously, who has a very good friend now in the person of the current prime minister. It's not certain to find such a good, reliable friend in the new government, and even European states like Italy. Italy is much smaller than France. It has a lot of serious business that it would love to be able to capture, and it doesn't need to redo all the work that it has done over the last several months. So you cannot assume that all states are genuinely committed to making sure that the elections happen. And then, of course, you have the United States. The United States is very, very attached to the ability of saying that everything worked out this year. And it's almost like the other extreme. So, and then, of course, you have and that's probably the most important thing, you have so many easy ways to politicize this issue. If you say that it's technically difficult, then it means that you want the current government. No, not necessarily. Maybe you're just being truthful. And then you have other people who feel them like they're as democracy obsessed as Thomas Jefferson, simply because they dislike the current prime minister. So you have a lot of distortions that you need to manage. So it's a complicated thing, but I think we should still be prepared to seeing it happen this year, simply because of the external pressure, for instance. And also, as I said, all the Libyan figures that dislike the current government are basically going to clamor for elections. They're going to try and consider running themselves, and you're going to see a lot of activity in that direction during the second half of this year.
Thank you, Jalal. I have two more questions, but this is a reminder for our audience to also submit their questions meanwhile, and I will connect also the questions of the audience with these questions. But I want to go back to some of these regional dynamics that you touched on, and we can argue or state that many regional actors caused much harm in Libya over the past decade. So taking into consideration this election moment, if you want, and the rapid changes that are happening now or happened over the past couple of months, can we say that we're witnessing a dramatic change in some regional calculations and interventions, or is it we cannot say that? It's overstatement to say dramatic changes in these. And where are we heading to in terms of, like, with the current indicators that we have in terms of regional dynamics and regional interventions, where are we heading to?
Well, I think we have to be very careful before anybody declares that there's a huge, drastic change in the way of thinking of this state or this other state. To give you an example, last summer there was a flurry of op-eds by French voices saying that now, France is going to think about Libya differently. And guess who's the new special envoy of France on Libya, with a very senior, influential role, is Mr. Haftar, the Paul Soler, the most committed defender and supporter of the offensive of Tripoli. So the only lesson that France could have learned, which is to stay away from this kind of way of thinking, has not been learned. So I think the best way to think about what has been happening for the last year is simply a slowdown. It's like a hibernation, mainly because of the new US administration, the Biden administration. For example, like you have the Senate that could maybe vote a bill that was already approved by Congress in Washington called the Libya Stabilization Act. If that happens, the UAE was the most consequential interferer in Libya for many years until January 2020, when Turkey decided to go all in. The UAE would love to to prepare itself for this moment if it should occur, to not be caught in the act. And that's what we have been seeing. But if you have a deterioration, if you have some kind of relapse into war, you can be sure that the Emirati bases in the west of Egypt would be reactivated. You'd have the networks ready to go, and probably all these quiet months are probably being used to even increase the political and sometimes financial influence of a shrewd actor like the UAE. So this idea that people like really slept very deeply one day and then woke up with a completely different way of looking at Libya is a very dangerous way of misleading yourself. And I suggest that nobody should even think about it. And even Egypt, which has been quite pragmatic this year, had begun showing signs of the same kind of pragmatism in 2018, before the offensive on Tripoli. It disagreed with it. It told a lot of actors, a lot of its friends, that it disagreed with that adventure. It happened because of the UAE, but Egypt is now as realistic as it was a couple of years ago. So it's better to assume that people are not changing. But as I said, things need to be quiet because there's no war. And there's no need to go crazy. And of course, the two physical, spectacular, visually observable modes of presence are the Turkish mission the probably 3,500 or 4,000 Syrian mercenaries backed by Turkey in the Tripoli Misrata area. And you have, of course, the big air base called Watia near the Tunisia border. And then you have this huge mission, the Russian mission, involving 3,000 Russian mercenaries with their own Syrian mercenaries and thousands of Sudanese mercenaries still in Libya, most of them on the side of Haftar. So you have a lot of foreigners still. And of course, you have direct contacts between, the UAE is not physically present. They removed its drones as early as December 2019 or January 2020. And as I said, it has a different configuration. It gave a lot of its bases to Russia and so on and so forth. So it's basically a change in configuration. And then we could discuss, of course, this problem of the departure of the mercenaries.
Exactly, and that's actually, there are two questions from our audience related to that, related to the presence and departure of mercenaries. Like, do you see the departure happening soon? I'm paraphrasing one of the questions, and one other questions: how do they pose a threat to stability of Libya as well? But also, do you see them departing and leaving Libya soon? So that's one question that we have. And another question linking it with the international actors relates to the EU collective response and also those of the member states. How do they impact the latest situation? So you mentioned the role of France, but is there any other collective response for the EU also to do here?
Well, I'll start with the EU. I mean, on the part of the EU, in moments of quiet, what they do is basically take advantage of those moments to project the image of a more unified set of European states, like coordinated visits in Tripoli, nice photo ops, and you have this visual illusion that Italy and Germany and France are aligned. But it's just cosmetics. Like, first of all, those moments are not meaningful at all because nothing is happening. And the other thing is if you dig a little bit deeper, you realize that France has one attitude and Italy has a different attitude and Germany is, and those are as divergent as before. So if the crisis were to become hot again, then we would see again the difference in mentality and exposure and attitude. So I don't see much change in that regard. Now going back to the question of, is it so important that the mercenaries leave before we conduct the elections, for example? Is it possible to have progress institutionally as long as the mercenaries are here? Well, for me, those issues are separate. I'm not saying the issue of continued presence by thousands of foreigners is a good thing. I think it's a problem. But this idea that they need to leave first before you can go to the booth, I mean, this is completely disconnected because those people are not except a few areas, they're not causing problems on either side. Now, what I would like to say about this issue is that I don't think it's going to evolve this year, simply because this idea that the Joe Biden administration is going to do everything it can to kick the Russians out because Russia is now viewed as an enemy, in contrast with the Donald Trump administration. I think that's also very misleading. The Biden administration is. First of all, if we need to do some physical things, if you need to dislodge, tough killers like those mercenaries, which I would like to remind you do not exist, right? They have never been recognized by the Kremlin. You have to kill them. You have to kill a bunch of them. And is Joe Biden going to do this in his first year in Libya? No, it just doesn't make sense, regardless of how you look at it. So the toughness required is not on the agenda. And the other thing also is that from the moment you recognize that the Russians are going to be hard to dislodge because there's no mechanism, no Libyan mechanism, no foreign market mechanism. And by the way, this idea that all Libyans agree that they should leave is completely false. I mean, if the Russians were to leave, the Haftar coalition would be in deep trouble within weeks. So you can be sure that every decision maker on the side of Haftar, regardless of how much friction has existed between the Russians and Haftar, Haftar would still choose the scenario where they stay because it's about his survival as an armed actor. So once you recognize that the Russians are not about to leave, then a corollary is that the Turks will be accepted by the United States and NATO in general. Of course, France doesn't think as a NATO member. France is completely obsessed with this, hostility towards Turkey. But what matters more here is the United States, and the United States knows that you don't have many tools to contain Russia and keep the current geography, the current map, the way it is. And so even if you're going to have a lot of awkward moments between Washington and Ankara, like the Hog Bank trial, you have other S-400 problem, all these things. But in Libya, we are very unlikely to see the Joe Biden administration cause any problems or any controversy with regard to the continued presence of the Turkish mission. Maybe we'll see the departure of the Syrian mercenaries because they're not vital, as opposed to the Russian mercenaries on the other side. But so the bottom line is that when you look at the whole picture, you realize that by December 31st, that most of these nice gentlemen are still going to be around.
And we have one follow-up questions related to the Turkish role and this new regional evolving dynamics. And the question is, how would the ongoing Turkish-Egyptian normalization would impact the dynamics in Libya? How to read the latest Egyptian initiatives in West Libya, for example, the visit of Egypt Prime Minister?
Yeah, I mean, I think Egypt has acquired its own foreign policy over the last couple of years. It realizes that it needs to take care of Ethiopia. It needs to act as a mediator in Gaza. It has to do a lot of things that it as its own man. And this wasn't the case 3 or 4 years ago when it was still under the shadow of the Gulf. And here I would go back to June 20th, 2020. When President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi gave a speech about the Red Line. He went to the west of Egypt and then in a very solemn way declared that, Turkey had to stay behind the Red Line. What did Egypt do physically? Nothing, right? It had, a few special forces, a lot of spies, but that has always been the case over the last several years in Libya. I mean, the parliamentary vote, the vehicles that were sent to Western Egypt, all these things didn't translate into any real intention to actually intervene physically on Libyan soil in an overt manner where you start losing men and have them killed by Turkish drones and all these things. Egypt simply doesn't want that. It doesn't, the current configuration is not the end of the world. It accepts, it's hard to say it, but it accepts what has happened. What has happened, and you cannot walk it back. And if the current configuration where Turkey doesn't go to the east of Libya, that is profoundly acceptable. Egypt also is mature enough to realize that you could have, it's still very possible scenarios, you could have some serious reconstruction efforts happening if the financial sector is kind of put in order a little bit, and then contracts start being distributed, and Egypt, as I said, is a realist. They want to send back their workers, and for that you need some kind of a modus vivendi with Turkey. And you have the same thing on the maritime issue. You have a dialogue that has been happening for the last year or a little bit more with Ankara. And does it matter for Libya? Not so much. I mean, it matters a little bit. I mean, it's better. It's always better to have Egypt. It's a giant in the area. It's better to have a calm Egypt trying to mediate, trying to be reasonable, trying to get involved, trying to take advantage of some form of economic revival. It's always better, obviously, but it's not a game changer. It's because it's not nearly as active as people typically imagine Egypt to be on Libyan soil, militarily speaking.
Thank you. I see so many questions, so let me try to get 2 or 3 in one go. So a question asking directly, do you think that Haftar will get hand on the central bank of Libya? And another question, how stable and secure is oil production and the handling of the revenues? I know these are two big questions, but there is a third question relates to an element that you mentioned earlier, relates to the 5+5. So the question is, how independent is the 5+5? They have made statements at odds with either side, and regarding the parade, what role can they continue to have? The question said.
Yeah, I'll start with the 5+5. It is true that it's typically a situation where you don't want to have too much independence. Otherwise, you'll have like those beautiful statements and nice promises, and then nothing happens. You want dependency. You want an umbilical cord towards the true leadership of both military camps. As I said, both sides. And so an idealistic 5+5 that kind of agrees with you whenever you say something reasonable is completely useless. You want the disagreement to be aired within the negotiation room so that you can work things out. And this hasn't been noticed. As the person who has the question noticed, sometimes you have completely out of whack announcements that are not followed through. But I would say that in general, the 5+5, I mean, it's like you have to imagine that its geographic influence, the geographic area where it was able to contribute something slightly positive, is quite limited. And it's not growing. It's not translating into something, more authentic, more ambitious, more aggressive, and nationwide, which is what it's supposed to be, like a real unification. So the 5+5 is kind of slowly dying, if you will. And now, going back to the two economic questions, they are very good questions. The current prime minister, if he had been able to get very early on, let's say in March, right away, good behavior on the part of the House of Representatives, good approval of a nice, fat national budget with nice leeway, maybe he would have been so strong financially, he would have been able to perhaps contemplate getting rid of someone that he has been very close to for more than 10 years, the current governor of the central bank in Tripoli, who has been in that position since the autumn of 2011. Now, what happened is the national budget was not granted. So in that circumstance, you better be very, very close friends with someone that you know already, who is the all-powerful, exceedingly powerful governor of the central bank. So now you basically have two men who have learned that they live in circumstances where they have an interest in actually working together. I'm not saying they're in love with each other. I'm not saying that it's all rosy, but you cannot be difficult on the national budget and then still expect the prime minister and the High Council of States, which is the presidency is controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood, to suddenly accept your apparent demand that the governor be changed. And that's officially the position of the House of Representatives. But what we have seen over the past 10 years is that very often you have these kind of demands, but deep down, if you look behind the scenes, there's an acceptance that the governor, the man, has become an institution. So yeah, everybody loves to criticize him, but things have been kind of working, more or less in an ugly way, but still working. Things have not collapsed. At the last minute, he somehow always finds the money to do the right thing for things to kind of, continue operating. I expect this kind of dynamic to persist throughout the remainder of the year. Now, in terms of oil revenues, the one process that needed to happen, according to the former special envoy of the United Nations to Libya, Stephanie Williams, was this discussion about how to share revenues. Same thing. If the national budget cannot be granted, how can you, in all serenity, sit down and discuss this ultra political, sensitive, delicate issue of sharing the revenues? So right now you have effectively a process where the oil revenues are accumulated in an account controlled by the National Oil Corporation, and then it releases it step by step. So as I said, things are awkward, things are tense, And I would like to see more discussion about those economic and financial issues. I think I haven't forgotten any of your
No,
questions. Yeah.
I think I also asked all the questions. We have two more, but please, if I forgot any questions, please remind me in the chat function. So the first question here, is there any chance that the House of Representatives will allow parliamentary elections within 3 weeks? And if not, will Berlin follow up meeting to do anything such as impose sanctions, or is that a fantasy? And the second question quickly here, will there be any foundations for a collaborative effort between Libya and Italy?
Yeah, the sanctions question is a very good question. In theory, we should see this kind of discussion, this kind of veiled threats by the United States, by the UN, by anybody whose sanctions would be meaningful. And we haven't seen that. So, for example, the new special envoy, Jan Kubis, has not used any of that language. So what we are seeing is apparently a rather naive attitude when he's just asking for the vote to happen before July 1st. We're awfully close. And we wonder whether it might happen. Of course, the parliamentary votes that happened on March 10th shows that the impossible is possible. So we should not rule anything out. But what I would like to highlight here is that you still have an ambivalence on the part of the UN process and the way the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum is being managed. All these things are not fully mobilized. You have a disconnect between how close the deadline is and how much tough work needs to be done by then. And the lesson, I'm sorry to repeat myself, the lesson about the national budget, which is very, very important, because a lot of, many expenditure types are being frozen because of this lack of progress. And I'm not even talking about the banking crisis, which you should trigger a reunification, an urgent reunification of the entire sector. None of this is being done. People are being complacent. I'm talking about the HOR and other actors. The lesson is that we should not be optimistic, especially if you're in a hurry. And that lesson is not being drawn. So that's what I would tend to say.
Jalel, with all this complexity, I mean, dare I ask, who will dictate the future of Libya? I mean, you provided such a complex picture between, for the internal dynamics, the external dynamics, external actors, regional dynamics. Who will dictate it? Who will dictate the future of Libya? And I think with that maybe difficult question, we will end the webinar.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I love to kind of try to see if there's a theme that has been recurring over the last 10 years, and sometimes even more than 10 years. It's always good to go back to the Gaddafi era, which hasn't been studied as much as the post-Gaddafi era. And I would tend to say two things. First of all, the United States usually has the power to do a lot of things, but it doesn't utilize that power. And I think at the current juncture, we are typically in that kind of situation. And I would tend to remind everyone that, we should not expect, the Washington to consider Libya as a top priority, especially knowing that the current situation is not that bothersome from an American perspective. The other thing is that the very nature of the conflict, of course, it's less intensive compared to Syria, compared to Yemen, but it's still, proportionally speaking, an awfully destructive, inefficient conflict. It's a conflict that reflects so many divisions. It's not one that is dominated by an actor that happens to be very, very smart and is able to accumulate wealth or is able to improve their situation. For a little bit of wealth captured by an actor, you have 10 times, 20 times, 50 times that wealth being simply destroyed irreversibly. So it's not an efficient, smart conflict. It's a very disjointed conflict. So the idea that Libya would see its fate being determined by one entity is unfortunately impossible, and that's part of It's unlikely, at least, and it's part of this problem. And of course, I'm not saying that the people of Libya do not exist. I think there's an awful amount of common points between Libyans, and sometimes they themselves don't realize it because of the distance. But if you speak with someone who's immersed in the east, and then the next hour you speak with someone 800 kilometers, 1,000 kilometers, they're not saying very different things. They usually have the same concerns, but the division in terms of the economics, in terms of geography, and in terms of living conditions, and the impossibility of organizing politically across the whole nation because of fear, because of deterrence, that means that the Libyan people is not able to pound on the table and take control of the situation right now. It's not necessarily going to be true forever, but that's this year. That's what I see, at least.
Thank you, Jalal, for all these insights that you offered us over the past hour. And I'm very sorry for running over time. I just couldn't stop this conversation. We received so many questions, and we're still receiving many questions as we speak. But I'm afraid we have to conclude this session. And thank you for all the audience, for all the excellent questions, and Jalal for all the excellent responses and insights. And it's always wonderful to hear your analysis, although it's not particularly the future that, I always remind myself that a couple of years ago we had this session, and I ended the session saying, let's hope that next time we have another webinar, we will talk about less bleak future. I still hope we will talk about more prosperous future in future sessions for Libya and the broader region of Middle East and North Africa. But for now, the conversation is definitely to be continued. And I would like to thank you again, Jalal, and the audience for being with us today. And this is a very quick reminder that next week on the 8th of June at 2 p.m. Geneva time, we will have another webinar on Morocco's foreign policy. So please register, be with us, and come ready with all your questions as well to the webinar. Jalal, thank you once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My honor. Being with us today. Bye-bye.